The first value I want to talk about in either a sine or cosine function, it doesn't matter what that says, sine or cosine in terms of this number, is the c value, that number at the very end. That number is going to affect how it's being shifted up or down. So with any of these equations, if there is no number at the end, the midline will just be the x-axis. It'll be 0, y equals 0. We can move that up or down by adding or subtracting a number at the very end of this graph. So we call that the vertical shift or midline. And it might look like the x-axis in some cases, and it might look like a number above or below the x-axis, depends on where it shifts. So let me graph a couple so you can see the difference here. So if I do y equals sine x, again, make sure you're in radians. So, click the toolbar and go down here, make sure it's in radians, not degrees. You're going to see that that midline here is the x-axis. So that would be y equals 0. In fact, you can test that, y equals 0. And that should be right halfway between the maximum and the minimum value. But we can also make that number move higher or lower. So I could do sine of x plus 3. And that's not going to affect how tall or narrow the graph is, but it will affect where the midline is. So the midline would be y equals 3, halfway between the minimum, which is 2, and the max, which is 4. You could also do minus a number. So you could do minus 4, for example. And then the midline would be y equals negative 4. So whatever number is halfway between the max and the min is going to be your midline. And the nice thing about these functions is it'll always be the number either added or subtracted at the very end. So it's not going to change from that. If it's minus 4, the midline will be y equals negative 4. And that applies to whether it's cosine or sine. So if I put a cosine there, it's still going to have a midline of negative 4. In fact, if I do y equals sine of x minus 4, they both share that midline, negative 4. It's just a matter of where they start. Remember, the sine starts at the midline, whereas the cosine starts at the max. So that's the only difference in terms of the sine and cosine is where do they start, but the midline would not change for either one of these. So a couple things about the midline. You can get the maximum and minimum from the midline. If you know how much above or below the midline it goes, we can add or subtract that. So in this case, the max is at negative 3, the min's at negative 5, and that's the y values here, by the way. And the midline is halfway between them. So we go up 1 or down 1 to get to those maxes and mins. And we'll explain what those numbers mean, the max and min in another video. So midline is the c value, again, the c value, the number being added or subtracted at the end. If there is no number being added or subtracted at the end, it's y equals 0, the x-axis. Now, let's play around with that midline. So on these questions that you're going to be assigned, it just says determine the equation of the midline of the graph. So it doesn't matter. I mean, you can look at this graph and say, well, it starts at the maximum value. It's a cosine. But that's not important right now. I want to know what number is halfway between the max and the min. Can you think of what it is? It'd be 3. But you don't want to just put 3. That would be wrong. You'd want to put y equals 3. So always put y equals whatever number that is in the middle. Let's do another one. On this graph, can you tell what the midline is? Well, it looks like it has a max of negative of 1 and a min of negative 1. So halfway between that would be 0. So it does have a midline. You don't say the x-axis, you say y equals 0. Submit your answer. And it'll show you right there. It's right on the x-axis, so y equals 0 is that equation. Let's do one more. All right, this midline here is in the negatives. It's halfway between negative 2 and negative 4. What would that be? It should be y equals negative 3. So just to get an idea of what the midline is, it's really just that number at the end of the equation. It's always y equals a number. So here's your midline for that problem. All right, that's midlines. Hopefully that's very helpful for you. The next video, we'll talk about amplitude. So thank you for watching.